Good evening. I'm so glad you're all here. And as one wise person once said, it's not about the size of the crowd, it's about the level of engagement and investment of the crowd. And I want to say hello to all of those who are watching on the recording. We're very pleased to have our third session with our Legislative Advocacy Committee hosting. I want to thank our two school board members who are hosting this, Dr. Hoig and Ms. Willis. So thank you for hosting. This is our third session. We've had one in January with the Wisconsin Public Education Network. We had a session last month with Ann Chapman from the Wisconsin School Business Officials Organization. And this month we're really happy and pleased to have Tom McCarthy from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Tom's presentation is powerful. It will move you. And it's very factually based. And it talks about what we're facing here in the state of Wisconsin as it pertains to not only school funding, but then what impacts it has on our children and what levels of service we can provide. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone off to our leader at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, Mr. Tom McCarthy.
Before we get going, you all are very lucky to have this man in your districts. I've known Dr. Means, and we'll get to it in his presentation, since he stood up and raised his hand to lead a very important conversation around achievement gaps, as we referred to them back in the day, and took part in a very important and impactful study around how we look at districts that are doing a better job of beating the odds in the state of Wisconsin. Some of that stuff is going to come up today. Before we begin, I am an always lifelong learner at heart, and one of the things that colleagues like the brilliant Carl Lovings, who's sitting back here at the DPI, have taught me is that it's really important to establish some norms for people before you begin a presentation. Some of these are things that I always talk about at the beginning anyways, but I'm going to put them on a board for you so that you understand where we're going, because we're going on a journey together. This is a small group, so each one of you I'm going to ask a question of at some point in this presentation. If you do not bother me with questions, and it's okay if it works both ways. So please know that my number one goal in this presentation is to build knowledge. I'm going to throw a ton of stuff at you. I'm really glad I'm coming after Ann Chapman, because I can go real deep in school finance and it makes people's eyes roll in the back of their heads. So if she's already done that to you once, maybe I will succeed and you'll be able to ask me some questions about school finance that I might not anticipate. Because when I say building knowledge, some of the things that I'm going to present to you happened because people asked us questions in the middle of this presentation. They raised their hand and said, hey, wait, guy from DPI, did you think about this? And I said, no, I did not. Let me go back and talk to researchers, and that helps me build a more robust presentation going forward. Number two is that it doesn't matter where you fit on the political spectrum or what your beliefs are. My goal is to make sure that you leave this place being a better advocate for what you believe in. If that's public education, awesome, that's what I'm here to teach you about. If you want to choose to do something else with that, that is your prerogative. But building knowledge and being better equipped to advocate what you need, what your family needs and what your people need, is the goal of this presentation. And finally, thanks to Dr. Means and some folks inside the district, we're going to do a little bit of brainstorming at the end of this. So normally the output of my presentation is, wow, that's a lot of problems, how do we solve them? We talk about the biennial budget, we talk about the lawmaking process. Today, we're also going to brainstorm a couple of big questions that I believe are over here on board. You get to walk over and see what each other are writing. I love that exercise. But as we're entering this, I do want you to keep them front of mind as we're having some of these conversations, because they're incredibly relevant. How can a diverse and supportive school community best equip all students to reach their full potential? That is such a beautiful and brilliant question. It's one that if I had the answer to, I would quit my job and go all over the state and teach people. So if you can help me, let's do it here today. And what are some strategies a concerned citizen can do to best advocate for greater funding? Again, awesome. I can give you the start of those, but a lot of that rests on relationships and previous successes that you've demonstrated. So that's where we're going today. Any questions, any thoughts? Please know I will call on you. Anybody before we jump in? Wonderful. So this is even better for me because Ann has been here. Normally when people ask me to present, they say, oh, I want to learn about school finance. And I have to convince them that actually what you don't want is that. You do want it, but you need it after understanding what's actually happening in the state of Wisconsin with how schools work. And a lot of that is centered on the fact that we are undergoing a demographic shift over the last 2 to 3 decades because we have these things called arbitrary borders that are school districts that have not been reflected in some of the policy mechanics that exist in how we educate kids. So in other words, how do I say that more simply? People change, and our systems and structures have not changed to reflect the need changing in each of our communities. And I think right here is a classic example of that. I can say that to you conceptually, you live that every single day. The TOSA of today is not the TOSA of 1987, 1993 when we rocked in revenue limits. And that is a lot of what our districts are confronting. And it looks a little bit different no matter where you are. So what this map is, and it'll get moving in a second here, I believe, is it is a depiction of the level of poverty in every single school district in the state of Wisconsin, all 421 of them. And the darker blue means that the district has experienced a greater increase in poverty over time. And this map starts at a period in time in 2008. Who was alive in 2008? We all were. Does anyone remember what was going on at that period of time? Right? Some of us call this the Great Recession or the first Great Recession because we sort of had another recession in this bubble too. But this map shows, frozen in time in 2008, the amount of change in students that have reported or been qualified for free and reduced lunch in our school system. I will give you this presentation, so don't worry about taking too many notes. You can take pictures if you'd like. We love free media of showing how cool our maps are. But you'll notice that the state as a whole gets really dark blue. That's not good. You'll also notice that it's not necessarily uniform. You're starting to see some pockets as you watch this a few times of yellow that exist across the state. But all in all, statewide, 1 in 3 districts have student populations that are more than 50% economically disadvantaged. Now I get to start calling on people. Takara, you can't answer this because you know what this question is. Can anyone define for me what it means to be economically disadvantaged? That seems like a really weird, jargony political term. But I feel like we gloss over this a lot. Econ disadvantage, it's a technical term. What do you think that's based in? I will call on people. Whoever looks at me last tends to be my victim. Anybody want to venture a guess what this means? You can put it out in real terms, fake terms. I got you first.
Income level and household size.
Income level and household size, that's right. So that is the generic description. Anyone want to venture a guess at what that is? Does anyone know what the federal poverty limit is? Either in real terms or in generic, just ideas. What was that?
Way too low.
Way too low.
Not actually realistic because it's based upon the assumption that someone's going to have 3 meals a day, but it doesn't take in housing, it doesn't take in the cost of maintaining a car or transportation.
You're right. It's
So
based on
wherever it's set every year, it's way too low. But it's typically, it also depends on your household size. So a single adult with 2 kids might, I don't know what it is right now, 0.2.
You're knocking on the door right now. Yes. So it is based on the federal poverty limit, and free or reduced lunch is sort of this marker that exists in here. So if you qualify for free or reduced lunch, anybody work in a school district and want to venture a guess at what the FRL percentage is? How much it means in real dollars? Anybody going to gamble? Okay, now I'm going to take the gloves off and let Takara jump in. Takara, you want to jump in on this one? No?
No, I don't have that trivia.
So for a family of 4, what we're talking about in real dollars, if you've got 4 people in your household, doesn't matter if it's mom and 3 kids, mom and dad and 2 kids, what you're looking at to qualify in this, to be determined to be economically disadvantaged, is around $25,000 to $35,000 in your household income. That's not accounting for near poverty, it's not accounting for the dip in and out of that particular marker, but this is a real statistic that impacts people's lives. And regardless of what you think was going on in 2008, because there are a lot of people that would say, hey, we were underreporting poverty, right? If you're reporting it on participation of free and reduced lunch, there have been things that have changed programmatically. We have direct certification, which means that if I have Medicaid as a benefit, all of a sudden I can qualify you for free and reduced lunch. We had people in the Great Recession who maybe were on the borders that said, hey, you know what, free lunch is great, I would like to do that. But we've also had deflating factors, like the community eligibility provision, which means that if I get to a certain threshold in my district, everybody qualifies for free or reduced lunch. That disincentivizes people to certify their income. But the barrier, the reason I'm dwelling on this, is that 185% of the federal poverty limit, which is what this is a very low number. That is not somebody who has accumulated wealth, who's qualifying for a government handout easily. That's low. And if you're at 185% of the federal poverty limit in this schema, There's a whole bunch of other supports that you need as well. It's not just about lunch. This is a true and damaging measure of poverty, and it means that you have a kid in that school system who is experiencing that. And statewide, 1 in 3 districts, 50% or greater. 1 in 3 districts, 50% or greater. At that same time, we've had a change in where people live. So for a long period of time, probably dating back to around like the mid-90s, Wisconsin has been what we would call a declining enrollment state. And by that, I don't mean that there aren't as many people in Wisconsin, although that is a phenomenon that's happening now. What I mean is that most of the school districts in the state of Wisconsin were experiencing declining enrollment. Back in the day, when we used to give this presentation, I used to get real funny with geometry, right? I would say, hey, think of a balloon, right? If you have a hot air balloon or any sort of balloon with air in it, and you squeeze it, what happens to the balloon? What does the balloon do? What's its shape do? It moves, right? Exactly. And so this slide, which again has the enrollment change, dark blue means that you are losing, and yellow means that you are gaining students. So back in the day, we used to describe it as a balloon squeeze. If you're losing kids and the overall number of kids are staying rather stagnant, it means that some districts are gaining, which you can really see at that last slide, which is sort of stuck at right here. We've got a lot of dark blue districts, and we've got a lot of bright yellow districts, and they're somewhat proportional. However, over time, we've started to experience in the state of Wisconsin a loss. We would be what the Census Bureau would call a dying state. There are not as many people who are coming here. Our birth rates are lower, which means that this balloon analogy that I'm giving you isn't really real anymore. Now it's kind of like a balloon that's losing air. So we're squeezing it in some of these districts, and it's sort of exactly scooting around the room, and it's running out. But with that, what we see, and this second statistic is the one that's very, very interesting to me, is that 75% of the students in the state of Wisconsin are located in 30% of the districts. Here comes my favorite activity. How many people in the room are Wisconsin graduates? Hands up in the air. Okay, I got 2, 3. I got 3 of them. Districts that you graduated from.
Sun Prairie.
Green Bay.
Madison.
All of them increasing enrollment for the most part. Now Madison is a little bit stagnant, Green Bay is a little bit stagnant. Sun Prairie, the second fastest growth district. And also all 3 of them, very large districts, right? And this is normal. This is actually what you would consider to be not a statistical anomaly. This is actually how statistics work. The majority of the kids in the state of Wisconsin are educated in a small number of districts. We have 421 districts, and they're scattered across the state. The majority of them are experiencing declining enrollment. And something is going on in these yellow districts that's keeping people there or having them increase. And that phenomena has some correlation. So this is the next part of my presentation that I love to do. Does anyone want to venture a guess at what the heck is going on in some of these yellow districts? What's happening? You can't answer right away. Let other people have some fun first. There are a few things about these districts that make them unique and different. And before I give you the answer key, I would like you to see if you can venture some guesses at what's happening.
Are businesses going to those locations?
That is a great answer. So a lot of them have economic engines, right? So they're drawing people because it turns out people need jobs, they need to make a living. And when they go to a place to make a living, they settle, they have a family, and those families have kids. Those kids go to school. And this enrollment piece drives that. So yes, that is a great answer. That is one of the things that connects these. How about other things? What brings businesses places?
People.
People. What actually physically brings them there?
Money.
Keep going. How did I get here today, do you think? Did I snap my fingers and just... Ooh, okay, there's another one. Maybe that there's something going on in these areas related to transportation. Anybody familiar with their Wisconsin geography?
They say there might be just Minneapolis, Twin Cities, kind of like spillover effect, because that's real. That's reached all the way down to northwestern Wisconsin.
There's some spillover effect, but the spillover effect isn't uniform because, you know, this is decently close to this is decently close. What do you see and what do you know about your Minnesota, Wisconsin geography over there on that part of the state? And it does still have to do with transportation, so I'm dwelling on the same point. What was that?
Roads, highways.
Big roads, interstates. So if you look at all of these yellow districts that show up on this map, and in a second I will overlay this so that you can understand that I'm not just making this up, they are all connected by the interstate system. Pretty remarkable. But when you really think about it, that is a policy choice that's driving jobs, it's driving where people live, because it makes it easier to get around, it makes it easier to have a family. Having connection to transportation, it turns out, is very important for all of the other underlying issues of why people live in a place. Let's see if you can get this last one. And I have to, people who have seen this, please don't jump in yet, because I want to see if someone's got the brilliant answer. Something else is very unique about the areas specifically that are yellow.
Are they major cities? I don't know what's
They are major cities. You are right about
If
that.
we had major cities.
If we had major cities, yes.
See, television.
But not every major city in the state of Wisconsin has what these communities have.
Universities? Oh, campus. Very
Bingo! 4-year campuses, right. So when you think about this map and you go, oh man, why is this happening? And you look at these two together and they have an impact. What you notice about these communities is that they are outliers in terms of A, being connected to the grid, the transportation grid, and B, they have access to an institution of higher education in their backyard. So while I can sit here and tell you this is exactly it, this is the smoking bullet, we found it, something about the presence of being connected to transportation and higher education drives a lot of what we see in terms of enrollment growth. However, there are still some outliers in this map, right? So we've got one central here that's super yellow. We've got one over here that's super yellow, and I love picking on these districts because they're doing super well. Takara Lovins.
Have we / you looked at the change in sort of the real estate market as well, and looking at where new construction has taken place and sort of the rising rental home sale prices? I'm thinking like specifically River Falls. I know that's been a spillover area from the Twin Cities, mostly driven by real estate and the cost of housing. And also where cities have rezoned entire cities to increase the density, which often just can literally, in a place like Wauwatosa where we are bound by our boundaries, you can actually continue to add more people at a particular ratio for apartments and all those things. If you actually just make your city more dense, have you / we analyze the layer of real estate and just construction, especially post-2008?
I have not. Our research team has not. But I think you just asked a really critical question that in working with DOR, we can figure out how to program into this. So, as I said at the beginning, this is how new slides are developed. These critical questions about, did you think of it this way? Sometimes the answer is no. In fact, when we were doing this presentation, this part right here with the system was somebody standing up in a crowd like this and going, wait a minute, I know what's going on here. It's higher ed. And the guy that used to give this with me and I looked at each other and we were like, wow, neither of us have thought of that. And now we do, because it's true. It's a component of fact that we, as people that lived in South Central Wisconsin, had not taken into account. But I'm not letting us off the hook, because there are a couple of other, and you sort of touched on it earlier.
Population expansion through.
Yes, and that's the magic connection between,
What is that?
that's the magic connection between your 2 points, is economy and influx of different populations cause a couple of really interesting phenomena to happen, where you have increasing enrollment and you have different populations living in there. Abbeyland meets Arcadia Furniture, and then there's a Tyson plant up there in that top one that is driving an influx of people to an otherwise dying community because they need to work. The economic piece is connecting with the fact that it's regionally close to transportation, and it is pulling people into those communities, where their neighboring communities aren't receiving that same sort of bump. They're not getting that bumper.
Kind of along the same vein as Takara, like have you looked at it from like an affordable housing perspective, right?
No.
You know, like if you consider that 1 in 3 districts have over 50% families that qualify for free and reduced lunch, I wonder if these areas are attracting those families. I mean, not just for the job, but also because of the affordability of living in those areas.
Precisely. Yeah. Yeah, there are a host of factors that are sort of out of the control of education, right? So schools, this is where I get to use one of my other favorite lines. If any of you brought your handy-dandy pocket constitutions along with you, there's this pesky piece that's Article 10 And it lays out the fact that we have to provide a free and appropriate public education to everyone in the state of Wisconsin. What it doesn't say is only if I live in a yellow district that has increasing enrollment and isn't experiencing vast poverty, right? It does not care. You have to educate a kid. It has to be as nearly uniform as practicable, and it has to be available from the ages of 4 to 20. That's what our lawmakers, when we created the state, decided was a critical factor. So you beat me to my point of saying, it doesn't matter where you live in the state of Wisconsin, you gotta do the job. And these underlying factors that are impacting it, us providing education being the it, have to remain neutral of all these conditions. And many of the policy levers and pieces that we use to try to serve these kids are outmoded, is the point that I would like to make in this section, is this experience requires a different education system that we do not have. We're not equipped for, and we're not funded. We got deep into this before I can even tell you. Holy cow, look at this. This is a numerical depiction of what I speak to. And this idea that, you know, if you go around the room and ask people what their educational experience was, what district did you go to, while 53% of our districts are smaller than 1,000, when you poll an audience of people, what you find is most of them went to a large district. That's how math works. It's okay, it's fun, and we get to like laugh about it a little bit. But, you know, most of our districts that we're talking about from a policy perspective are small ones. When I say most, I mean we have 421 of them, and the likelihood that you went to one that isn't a large urban or large suburban is low. But that is the uniform experience we're programming for. And that's why when you watch some of the, what I would call the outstate conversations about how we do public education differently, it tends to be dominated by this idea that we need to do something about rural education. We need to do something about declining enrollment. It's because these districts are represented by people, and those people make decisions. But the majority of the students, the learners, are actually not in those districts. They're in places like the ones that we're standing in today. Okay, that was a lot of information about demographics. These are the two maps frozen in 2021 at the same time. And you saw the overlay of roads, UW system institutions, and we talked about economics. We talked about housing in this section. Is there anything else anybody has questions in on this part of demographics? So we're talking about poverty, and we're talking about where the numbers of kids are. Before we start diving into different demographics.
Are we gonna kind of separate it by race?
We are gonna talk a little bit about that. You bet. Yep. And it's not as clean of a conversation as this one, so get ready for some more mess.
That's my curiosity, is like where, like who is like migrating to these places and why?
So I didn't send you the slides beforehand, right? Good, because it's in here. Anything else on folks' minds? Enrollment, poverty, moving maps, aren't they pretty? Things that jump out to you, ponderings in your brain.
How does this compare to other states in the Midwest?
That's a fantastic question. Wisconsin is unique in one way compared to our Midwest partners. We have a boatload of school districts. 421 districts across 72 counties. That is abnormal. I think there are 2 other states that are like us, and both of them are East Coast states. And what I would say about that is that this is a relic of Wisconsin's rich and strong tradition of local control. So if you could believe it, go on a journey back to the 70s with me, we had 2,000 districts. And they came from the idea of a one-room schoolhouse, where you had these very small schools that were educating people around them. And as consolidation was forced to happen, the legislature said, we can't deal with this crap, there's too many districts. So they started consolidating them, and your region of the state is a really good example of how that consolidation project did not happen uniformly. There are still districts around here, in fact, real close to you, that are still operating as a K-8 district. So in other words, a school district only serves K-8, and then there's an umbrella, what we call the Union High School District, that serves all of the K-8s within that community. That is a relic of the one-room schoolhouse function of the state of Wisconsin. And when we talk about consolidation, we talk about what's the answer to the problem of why is Wisconsin unique, it's shrinking the number of school districts, and your area of the state is the ones who freak out once that conversation starts happening, because it means this district doesn't exist anymore. This district is scooped in with a bunch of other districts and squished. So we face an odd dynamic, and all of it sort of goes back to this, this loss of humans in the state of Wisconsin, this sort of centralization or urbanization of the state of Wisconsin, and the fact that we still have 421 districts that are searching to serve those kids. It's a great question.
Have other states been successful in consolidating school
Yes.
districts?
Yes, yeah. I think the example I would use from a Midwestern perspective, while not quite on the scale of Wisconsin, would be Iowa. So Iowa moved from having, I think, like 200 or so to having a countywide system, and I don't remember exactly how many they have, but it's not many, it's like 40 something. And I would argue, having lived through this policy world enough, that it's easier for a state like Iowa because their large districts there's basically 2 of them, and then everybody else can respect their county boundaries and it works. Ours are messy. We have large urban areas that spill across county lines. When you get up to the Fox Valley, the cities don't respect the county geography. And all of that is a relic of local control. It's a relic of this idea that my district, no matter which one it is unique to me and it's controlled by my local people. So I would put us in the camp of a couple of these eastern United States districts where kind of like the one that I always commiserate with the most is Rhode Island, because Rhode Island has a ton of municipalities too, and they suffer from the same thing. They're tiny, but they have a lot of districts for the tiny size that they are.
So with the changing face of public education, right? I mean, it's declining across the nation. Teachers are harder and harder to find. I mean, is that the answer? It's consolidation. One of the ways that we can support more kids equitably.
It's definitely an answer that I would encourage everyone to think about, but it become in a state like Wisconsin, it's a challenging conversation because when you start actually laying out the maps, it becomes we commonly call them NIMBY problems, right? Like, not in my backyard. My district's great. Why do I have to join up with them? It's working well here. But if you do it collectively as a greater good conversation, it does start to push on some of those things. But the biggest impact spots that you're going to see are these rural districts that lack the economy of scale to be able to provide the same opportunities that you can here in Wauwatosa. I mean, that's where it really starts to add up and roll, because a lot of those people can't find the teachers to come to those districts. Or, as my boss, Dr. Unley, likes to talk about it, when you're in a rural district, you sort of act as the farm system for the large urbans and suburbans, where you bring a teacher on, train them, get them ready to go, and then they go to the big leagues because they can make more money there. It's a real tricky thing, but it would require, in political theory, like a kind of a Leviathan moment where everyone gives up their local control for a greater good, and that's an uncomfortable conversation.
I feel like a lot of districts, try to insulate themselves from, especially in like Wauwatosa, like from Milwaukee kids, right? Or like what you said, how those like county lines kind of start to blur. Like,
Bingo.
I'm sure there's plenty of districts even up north that probably face similar.
In the up north districts, we have some countywide districts up north too. So yes, you're right, and that's why I always bring it back. In audiences like the one I'm sitting in, the conversation about consolidation will be the most challenging in areas like this. It's not going to be hard for these districts down here in Southwest or these districts in Central to understand how to work with their partners because they have to do it to survive. They're using our regional service providers to purchase special ed teachers, to rent business managers, right? Like some of these smaller, very sparse districts do not have a business manager in their district. They pay their cooperative educational service agency for that particular intervention and service, and that's how they get that work done. That's how dire the stakes are in a lot of these sparse rural districts in Wisconsin. And that just continues to roll downhill all the way into like classroom offerings where you might not have career and technical education in some of these areas because you can't find a teacher, can't pay for a teacher. It's tricky.
Do you think that having so many districts and everyone kind of having their own interests, has that made it more difficult to advocate at the state level for like what is needed because everyone's asking for all their stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, without a doubt. And the counter to that, though, is that the idea of having all of that localization has allowed Wisconsin to come up with some really unique and beautiful solutions to very unique and local problems. So it cuts both ways, and that's what you would see in a conversation about consolidation is, don't take my thing away, I'm the only district in Wisconsin that can insert what they're doing, right? And that is unique to their local community. So I think the true solution factor is how do you program that? How do you keep that maintenance of my community needs this thing while also being able to work together in community, in democracy, to serve kids better. Never thought we'd be talking about consolidation today. This is why I love this stuff. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving a little bit. As I forecasted, we're going to talk a little bit about some other demographics going on too. And this is the number of homeless students in school districts. So what you see here is a fairly steady increase in the number of students who have qualified under what we call the McCarthy law, which is a federal law. I believe the program actually began right around where this chart happened. So what you're seeing is probably twofold. Homelessness being compounded by an increase in poverty, and also a new aspect of a program that protects these kids. So when you say, hey, I'm a homeless youth and I need to be served by this, the district has no choice. They have to serve you. And there are also a number of different protections that come along with that, transportation and non-disruption of their educational programming, that allow us to understand that when a homeless youth shows up in a school district, that is providing a new demand and a new need for that school district to serve. Here's my punchline, they give you nothing for that, right? In many of these small rural districts, that homeless youth coordinator that has to answer and talk to that kid about how do we help you is the enrollment counselor, the guidance counselor. My own personal story with this, I come from an education family. My dad was a special ed teacher for 34 years. My mom worked in various jobs across the school district. At the end of her career, she called me about McCarthy-Vento at least once a week. She lived in the Milton School District where I grew up. The Milton School District has about 2,000 kids. And she was calling me that frequently to say, what am I supposed to do with these kids? I am the coordinator. My mom, the guidance counselor secretary at that point in time. Filling in as an LTE was the McCarthy-Vento coordinator in a school district of 2,000 kids. No fun. You gotta serve. Most of the homelessness is, go ahead, Scar.
I was just going to clarify from my own knowledge, but was it McCarthy-Vento that clarified the definition or modernized the definition? Because I think in this one, it's even like within a 30 or 60-day period, the number of beds or homes that you do live in, which even from when I was a kid, that would be a more modern understanding of what homelessness can look like versus just literally you're living in a hotel or you're living in a car on the street.
That's
is
right.
that part specifically about McCarthy-Vento or is that different?
I believe that McCarthy-Vento actually gave the United States Department of Education the rulemaking power to define it, and they did define it as broader than just what you would consider the old school definition of homelessness, to also be, I don't know what the modern way of saying this would be, having a housing crisis, couch surfing, living with family members that are not your natural family, but it also empowered the youth who were experiencing that to basically just walk into an office in the school district and say, I'm a homeless youth. And there's limited things that a district can do to say, no, you're not. Much like those moving maps, disproportionate impact of homelessness, right? So this is 1920 school year cutting across our 7 largest or most urban districts and showing you that 50%, just about 50% of the homeless youth under the McCarthy-Vento program are served by those urban districts. So while it is an urban phenomena, it also is happening in rural districts, to my story about Milton, just not with the same frequency that it's happening in Milwaukee and large districts. If I'm going too fast, stop me, but I'm going to keep cooking through demographics here. The reason that homelessness becomes a conversation that we need to think about, and that as we talk about choice and mobility, I want you to remember this slide, and I'm showing it to you now because we're talking about students who we know to be mobile. Research, Wisconsin research across the nation, show us that if you are making decisions about where you're going to school, more than when you're naturally having a grade break. So if I'm matriculating from elementary to middle school to high school, that's a natural grade break. If you're leaving otherwise, the amount of times you leave will decrease your graduation rate. Does not matter what sector, does not matter what reason, does not matter at all. But if you're bumping around districts a bunch, you are less likely to graduate. And this is sort of a new and growing emerging body of research that as we look at the pandemic and the amount of choice that's happened in the pandemic, the amount of student mobility and migration, this is something that we are going to pay the price for when those kids reach graduation. They are not as likely to have graduated. I would hypothesize that the reason is that education is a scoped out program, right? So as you're thinking about the learning continuum that is happening in the schools, They have a plan for you. Dr. Means spends a lot of time with the school board figuring out what that plan should look like. If you break that plan and go somewhere else, it doesn't necessarily fit perfectly. When you have 421 school districts plus another 300 education agencies that you go to, private schools, choice schools across the state, you are disrupting this continuum significantly. So know that mobility has an impact in whether or not you're going to graduate. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other subgroups of students that we track and look at in the state of Wisconsin. This map, the darker the green, the higher the percentage, depicts the amount of students in a district that are experiencing a disability. The reason this isn't a beautiful moving map that shows you some exciting tale and picture is because this is a really localized conversation. Students who are experiencing a disability do not move much, and they largely leave or graduate when they're done, and it changes based on the enrollment cohorts of these kids. And so there's really not a lot of takeaway in terms of where these kids spread across the state, where they're spent programmatically, because they make that decision and they stick that decision.
I think we're kind of disaggregating students with disability because there's such a wide spectrum of students with disability, right? You can have an IEP for speech services, but you can also have an IEP for intellectual disabilities. Have you kind of like disaggregated the data to see where there's like a concentrate?
You mean across districts? Yeah. It's as arbitrary as this map is. We have done it, we have looked at it, it does not make a ton of sense. I'd be happy to provide you with the data. It actually exists on WiseDash, our public data dashboard as well. So each district, you can pull out and disaggregate by the primary disability type.
You know, because I imagine that there's a lot more diagnosis for like a speech disability, right? For, I mean in general, but also in districts that have the resources, right?
That's an interesting question. That we should look at. Because if you're trying to lump wealth of the district, relative wealth of the district against their desire or ability to qualify kids for additional services, that would be speaking on something I don't have data for.
This data is also pre-dyslexia policy.
It is pre-dyslexia. Yes, you are correct. Yep.
And my wonder too is like kids, you know, I think more Black kids get diagnosed for other health impairments like ADHD or behavioral disabilities, and I wonder if that's concentrated in urban districts.
Disproportionality is what we would call that, and it's not concentrated in urban districts. We see it as a statewide phenomenon. It is something that by federal law we're required to monitor and lift up. Because of the volume of kids, disproportionality does exist in urban districts. It does exist in places like Milwaukee. It also exists in places like Bayfield. Because it really looks at your demographics and says, based on how many kids you have, comparing you to the statewide average of where these demographics are supposed to go, how far out of alignment are you with that? And it's not just urban. Yeah.
Have you overlaid this property map?
A property map?
Poverty.
Poverty. Yes, it doesn't really show too much. There are districts that flip on and off. But the other main points, and you were sort of getting there, when people think about IEPs, they think about special education. A lot of people have this mental picture of a student experiencing significant disabilities. When in reality, what we're talking about with students experiencing disabilities are two major groups, which is a learning delay or a learning disability, and a speech or language impediment. And normally those are concentrated in younger grades, and they are things that people matriculate out of with a good services plan. The whole idea of special education for most kids is that you receive the supports you need and qualify into regular education. So we have this system that, if well-funded, should be serving kids. Now, here's the punchline, right? We are a reimbursement state in Wisconsin, and in special education, we reimburse about 30 cents on the dollar. I think we're projecting about 32% of the reimbursement rate in the state of Wisconsin now. So every kid in a district who says, through either some sort of parental advocacy or through assessment and classroom interventions, I need an IEP, means that all of the resources must be provided to that kid regardless of the funding available. which means that when they're qualified, they immediately become a situation where you are moving money out of the general operations or Fund 10 to Fund 27 to make sure that there's enough special education money because the state and federal government say you get 32 cents on the dollar. And that is not a great deal. So until that gets to 100%, every dollar we invest in special education is a massive, massive equity investment for service to all kids in that district. Didn't expect to go there today, did I? I promise I'm going to get to the race component you asked, but I also have a map for English learners. This one tends to concentrate as we think about Latino families, which we will show you next. They are the largest population of English learners. Not a ton of overlap with the other maps that I've shown you yet either, but trying to piece together the big conversation for you. As this says here, as I'm flipping through here, if you are isolating to the languages that most people are learning, it is Spanish, but Hmong is the next dominant factor. So when we think about language accessibility in Wisconsin, those are the two populations that we're trying to be cognizant of because they are the most common languages that are native to our students. No, we're getting there, don't worry. This is somewhat of old data here, but it is still something that I think if we surveyed and staffed now, we would find an even greater growth in some of these things. So in 2013, there was a big research body from the CDC that took a look at mental health challenges in schools. And what it found was that 1 in 5 kids have had a mental health issue. That does not mean that they are necessarily having a crisis. It means that at some point in their academic career, something happened to them where they would have benefited from some sort of mental health services and intervention and support. In Wisconsin, that meant about 174,000 kids in that point. I bet you if we looked at this number now, that number would have gone up. The pandemic rocked a lot of people. Most of the kids who would have qualified for that on a research basis do not get treatment, right? 80% of them had that mental health emergency, and it was just compounded into who they are today. But for the kids who did receive treatment, and this is not unique to Wisconsin, this is a national figure, 3/4 of them received that in a school-based setting. This research and this revelation is what sort of spun forward this conversation about school-based mental health services. It didn't come out of nowhere. And it makes sense when you think about the mental health continuum and construct that exists post-1970 across the nation. There isn't a place to receive those services. There is a shortage of services across the nation. It's not a Wisconsin problem. This is a national problem. But as we seek to serve it, this is my big caution flag for you. Schools can't be the only partner at this table. Schools are not equipped, and I think Dr. Means would agree with me on this, they cannot currently fund a mental health network for students and their families, which is where a lot of the issues come from. It's not just a student out of nowhere raising up and going, I'm having a mental health crisis. Usually there's a family-based or a home-based situation that's predicating it. We can't afford to deal with it ourselves, nor are we equipped to deal with it ourselves because it requires a vast professional network. So when we are talking about how to solve this problem at the state level now from a DPI perspective, we are leaning heavy on our county providers to say, hey, y'all, you're part of this conversation too. We can't solve it alone. How are we negotiating private contracts to serve these kids? How is the county stepping forward to also play a role in some of this stuff to make sure that when we identify problems like this, they don't go unserved? Because if we find out something and we don't deal with it, it is more likely to come back and bite us in some way, shape, or form. School safety becomes an issue, academic achievement becomes an issue, and this is the part where I get on my soapbox and tell you, I'm getting older, my hair's getting grayer, I want to retire at some point. And if we're going to continue to fail these kids from an academic and mental health perspective, what am I going to do? I'm not going to be here. Someone's not going to take care of me, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to be senile when I'm old. So I'm going to need some help. We all are. We also know that, flashback to that map of the moving thing with poverty increasing, poverty is directly correlated with achievement. It's not the only thing, but it is a massive factor. What you're seeing here is a scatter plot chart of our school and district report cards, grouped by their accountability ratings. The red's up at the top, higher poverty, lower score. Sorry, backwards. The purple's over here, lower poverty. God, I'm doing this backwards today. Hang on a second. Present for your lunch. Yes, I had it right the first time. Don't listen to me. Higher poverty is on the left, lower poverty is on the right. And what you see here is a graph that is largely a one-to-one representation. This is the 2018-19 school report cards. If I did them for the current ones, you would see the same phenomenon. The shocking part about this, we've been giving this little slide in presentation since about 2017 when we turned these on. In the middle of that continuum, we had a little thing that was called variable weighting added to report cards. Because we went around and talked to policymakers about this and said, hey, that's a problem. Report cards should measure something else. It shouldn't just measure poverty. That is broken. We've been doing that with standardized assessments forever. They said, you know what, guys, you're right. Let's do something different. So right now, if you have a high poverty school, it weights growth more than achievement. So if you are doing a good job to move kids along on the continuum, you're rewarded. Didn't break the correlation, still 1-to-1. We have a variable weighting growth system in the state of Wisconsin. It still measures poverty. That is what we are doing with the school and district report cards. There are a host of other factors that we've laid into this. We've scored them, we've done things unscored to try to say, hey, this shouldn't work this way. Something should be done differently. We have spent time doing root cause analysis with districts to say, when your data looks like this on the report cards, here are the tools you can use to intervene. But you know what we didn't do? We didn't actually give them tools. We talked to them about what they could do, what they should do, but those localized decisions that aren't funded end up measuring the same thing over and over and over. So here we are. I'm getting tired of this. I'm sure Dr. Means has seen this slide, I don't know how many times, 25, 30. We talked about this at the Achievement Gap Task Force a whole bunch, and there is nothing that is budging the system to be able to fix this. I will also note, this is a common phenomenon across all school and district report cards. We give school and district report cards to our choice partners as well. It is so bad that to the point that if you give me a number of free and reduced lunch, I can almost completely accurately predict where they will sit in that spectrum. You will see, there are a few outliers. You can see them popping up here, but they are rare.
Are there other states that are doing better?
At breaking the correlation between poverty and achievement, not really, to be honest with you. There are these really exciting pilots that states tend to get involved with and start demonstrating success at how to bust it and break it, and then political winds change and they tear it down and things revert. Because unfortunately, when we're talking about policy solutions, my brain thinks about a 12-year continuum. Most of the elected officials are thinking in 2- or 4-year continuums. They want to demonstrate that success so that they can stay in office, which is understandable, right? Some of them I really want to stay in office, so I want them to think about that. But unfortunately for kids, that's not how we evaluate whether it worked or not. I can't tell you, I can show you maybe some growth in 2nd grade because of an intervention that was given. That kid still has to make it all the way to 12th grade. So it requires a level of patience that, it's not just politicians, I would argue everyone in our country could stand to be a little bit more patient and calm about wanting some intervention and seeing whether it worked or not. Keep going, there's more to this puzzle. This gets scary when you think about the fact that, like many states in the nation, our population is diversified. So our student population becomes what statisticians would call a leading edge. So it is predictive of what is going to happen in the next coming years, because it turns out, many of you probably have spent a decent amount of time in Wisconsin. People who graduate from Wisconsin high schools are likely to stay in Wisconsin. So 19% of our population in 2019 identified as a person of color. In our school districts, 31% of the kids identified as people of color, which means when those kids graduate, they have kids, they stay in the state of Wisconsin, our population is going to continue to diversify. You'll also notice here, this is a list. It's probably too small for you to read. I will walk up here and read some of them. Many of our districts, 19 now, are majority-minority districts, which means the majority of the population is not white. But you have some grouping factor here, right, where they exist in a number of districts, so you're getting a similar phenomenon to that enrollment population piece, where a small group of districts are leading the change in the state of Wisconsin. But some of them are not the districts you'd expect. So, number one, can anyone read, does anyone have like 40-20 vision? Can read that up at the top there? Naumini Indian is the most diverse district in the state of Wisconsin. 90% of the population is American Indian in that district. Lac de Flambeau, similar story. Bayfield, also in this top list, 72% American Indian population. However, we're going to get into some oddballs. I already gave away the ghost on this one. This is Arcadia School District, right? That district that I pointed out is having a massive increase in enrollment, being driven by population at 75% Hispanic. okay? My other favorite, Abbotsford, 57% Hispanic Latino population. Now, join a thought experiment with me here. Go back to 1993 in Arcadia. Go back to 1993 in Abbotsford. And tell the resident who is locking in their local property taxes in 1993 as revenue limits are going to start being solidified in law forever, that they are going to, in 19, I want to say 21, in 2021 are going to have 75% of their population that is likely to need English language services to function in their community. And I would tell you, I have been to both of these school districts, I've been in these communities. This is not a place where there's conflict about whether those people should be here or shouldn't be. They are welcomed in the community, they are being served in the community. But the choices the district made in 1993, having no idea this is going to come and happen, handcuffed them to the level of service that they're providing those families. And you have industry, labor, business owners that are sort of leading a conversation of this is not working, this is broken, and we need to do something about it. The end result of what they do now is a referenda question, right? They say to their voters, hey, well, this isn't working, we need to figure out how to raise taxes to serve the families that we have here. But that's not fair, right? Because that is driving that difference between what they can do and what other districts can do. And that is not what our education system is founded on, because remember, it says 4 to 20 as nearly uniform and equitable as practicable. That's what the Constitution says. So why am I dwelling on this? Here's the map that you asked me for, I don't know, probably like 25 minutes ago as I've been rambling at you. This is the disparate impact of the different types of student groups across the state of Wisconsin. So you will see the first one that turns on this little moving map is our Asian students. They are in red. The second one that turns on is our Black students. They are in orange. Hispanic Latino is green. Native American is blue. That clustering phenomenon, when we go back to that other slide about majority minority districts, it's being driven in these little pockets where you're having an influx and a growth of those populations. Those are the people that are moving to Wisconsin. Those are some of the forces that are increasing enrollment in a number of these districts. The oddity in this formula here, though, this what you're seeing from the data perspective, is that nearly 90% of the Black students in the state of Wisconsin live in 6 counties. They are very, very isolated when compared to many of the other folks in the state of Wisconsin. And that is a historic trend. That's not an overnight trend. It's becoming more concentrated, not less concentrated. Okay, I bet you're wondering why is this guy talking so much about demographics? I came here to learn about school finance or something else. I don't know what it was. You were built to learn about. It's all been working up to this slide. So then State Superintendent Governor, now Governor Evers, was really interested in a lot of this information and research. And we spent a number of months talking about this because for a very long time, Wisconsin kind of buried its head in the sand about the achievement gap. The achievement gap started to show for states across the nation as NAEP began to disaggregate results. And as NAEP disaggregated results, people looked at Wisconsin and said, whoa, I thought that was a great state. What the hell is going on here, right? We have always been a good state in NAEP. Not always great, but good in a number of different measures. And as we disaggregated that information, what it came out to show is that we were a great state for white families. We were not such a good state for our Black and brown families. And that was hidden in that data. So when we talk about assessment data and why many people view assessment data as a civil rights issue, it's because as we have informed more and more folks, we have figured out that 2 things are true. Assessments correlate with poverty. I've already shown you that. That is a nationwide trend. In many states, but not all states, assessment data also correlates to race as well. And what this bar graph shows is the result of a bunch of research where we said, it's gotta be poverty, right? I'm the guy that just showed you, this correlates 1 to 1. And so when we thought about the achievement gap, we thought, hey, you know what, we'll bust it, you know what we'll do it, is if we can solve the issue of poverty. That was a wild idea, right? You know, schools are not gonna be the only force to solve poverty, but it would have become a problem that, hey, you know what, we could have worked together and figured out how to do it. A targeted poverty assistance program is not unique in Wisconsin, and we thought, hey, there's gonna be political support for this, it will work. But we also knew we had data. And so we spent some time with that data. As a group, Dr. Means helped to lead us, and what we did is we disaggregated that another level further. We said, let's for our students of color, only show data for students who are not experiencing poverty. So these bar graphs right here are students groups, again, grouped by American Indian, Asian, Black, Hispanic, Pacific, two or more races, and white. In those bars, we took all the students in those subgroups who qualified for free and reduced lunch out. Okay, so they're gone. Imagine they don't exist. What we did is we compared them to their white peers who were impoverished. White students experiencing poverty compared to the subgroups of students who are not experiencing poverty. They're gone from the system. And what we see, this is 3rd grade English, and this is 8th grade math. What we see is that poor white students outperform Hispanic students, Black students, and American Indian students. If that's an issue that rests only on poverty, that is not what it should show. It should look like their white peers who flip upside down. When we compare a white student who is impoverished to a white student who is not impoverished, they outperform them, right? The guy that just showed you the graph, poverty impacts achievement. What this graph taught us is that something else is going on in the system that is not reaching these learners. Again, if I had the answer to this question, I would quit my job and go give it to everyone in the state of Wisconsin. I do not have that answer. And we have also wrestled with this problem in a number of different ways. But one of the things that we did do in this body of research is that we looked around the state for people who were breaking this trend, right? And we said, what are you doing from a classroom practices perspective to not have this happen to you? I wish I could tell you that the data was just this target-rich environment that we could pull all the way around. Dr. Means, how many was it, like 13 or so districts that could collectively point to another like 25-ish schools? We brought them in, and it was the stuff that you and I, all of us would probably talk about as being a highly effective strategy. Relationships, differentiated instruction, resources. That is what they were using to combat this problem, and they were winning. But the problem was that strategy wasn't being deployed statewide. It wasn't being deployed in every type of school. It wasn't being deployed in every school district. And so what we are continually left with, this is 2021 data, is that we consistently rank in the bottom of the nation in terms of gaps between our students. And we are stuck there. But I'll tie this back to the thing that I've been harping on all day here for the past hour. We also don't have policy solutions. We don't have drivers. We don't have incentives. So when people pick this work up and say, you know what, this is a moral cause, I'm going to do it, it's out of the goodness of the heart. It's out of the goodness of their local board. It's out of the support of their funders and their communities. It is not because the state of Wisconsin said, this is a problem we need to solve. Here are resources to solve it. I hate this slide. Eventually, I don't want this slide to be around. Eventually, I want to come to a presentation and say, these are the things that we did. This was 2021. Now is now, and this doesn't exist. Even marginally, I would love to turn on a slide for 3rd grade English language arts that doesn't show those gaps. And that is why we are doing things like evidence-based reading in schools, and why we are promoting the use of instructional materials and training that interweave culturally responsive education. Because here's my example for you. I grew up in a small town. It was a train depot. I told you it was Milton. There were lots of trains all over the place, right? That is the history of the city. We could sit down and have a lesson about trains, and it would make sense. What's the locomotive? What's the caboose? You go somewhere else in the state of Wisconsin, there's no train, and a kid has never seen a train, and you are exposing them to a learning exercise related to reading that talks about trains. That is not fair. That is not equitable. When people think about this culturally relevant teaching practice, that's the thing I want you to have in your mind. It's not about systemic racism. It's not about advancing one group or another. It's about providing the instruction in a way and means that makes sense for that kid. One of the best presentations I saw about this was actually from the Texas Commissioner of Education. And he faces a very different issue than we face in the state of Wisconsin. Has a massive Latino population that have a gap similar to this right here. And what he spoke to is finding ways that Spanish and English relate to each other and leveraging them in a learning strategy. Not fighting against it, but embracing it and using it. If a conservative state like Texas can pick up something like that and move it forward, I see no reason that a state like ours, a very purple state, cannot adopt a similar tactic to meeting kids where they are. Because that's what that's about. I've been prophetizing, and I apologize. Does anyone have questions about all the stuff that I just blasted through in terms of demographics? Because if your seatbelts are on, we're moving to a conversation about school finance. and then we're going to workshop and brainstorm some things to Cara Lovings.
I don't have to go first. This is a comment, but potentially a segue here next, and I'm taking off my DPI hat. Right over there, this is my parent hat now. So I was thinking about the increased poverty across the state, and simultaneously the decrease in home ownership across our minority populations in Wisconsin. And so 55% of white families own their homes. And we use property taxes as a vehicle for referendum dollars. And when we look at the 2020 breakdown by race, we have 89% of white residents vote, meanwhile less than 10% of every other race will also vote. So if we bring a referendum in order to give more money to the folks that we need in our schools, our resources, we're seeing through the data is primarily non-white students, and we see that in both the assessment, but also in the districts that are just increasing students and in seemingly odd places. But our voting population is mostly white, mostly homeowners who are directly impacted and potentially less likely to vote for a property tax increase. It's more of a thought. It's not a question, but hopefully a segue. Tell me if I'm wrong too. But
No,
I'm segueing us into school finance.
But what I think you're teasing out is an issue that a lot of communities face, which is how do I convince people that might not have what they think is an interest in a referendum question to vote to increase their own taxes? Because that is in effect what you're doing. And you painted it into beautiful stark terms. The other really common argument that you see in these referenda situations is elder people who have no kids and no grandkids in the district. And they look at leaders like Dr. Means and say, how does this benefit me? And what I would contend and argue plays back into that real estate question, but it also plays back into this idea of shared value. When we set out to create the state of Wisconsin and all these school districts, the idea was that public education would be the great equalizer, this change agent that would prepare the next generation for success and make the next generation better than the last. And us people now that are currently in this experiment are supposed to advocate and hold that up and push that forward, because public education is a public good. It's a resource that everyone buys into, whether it's immediately impacting you or not, right? And so it's convincing those or not people that while they're not directly impacted, my elderly farmer example, your family who is renting a house in an urban area example, still will have an overlap benefit for making that decision, right? Because it will then subsequently allow for a future investment that will make everyone within that taxation district, and hopefully in the state of Wisconsin, better off. That's my pitch for you, but it's a hard one to land, having been on the phone with some people that do not want to support something like this.
On your last slide, you
Yeah.
say different by gender for our Black students?
Yes, but it depends on the district. Yeah. It's not as universal. It's not as limited. So when you think about like Milwaukee has a black boys problem, some other districts have a black girls problem. I can't give you examples in the Hispanic Latino populations. Some of our American Indian predominant districts also suffer from that. It's not as easy for me to pin off. But I will say gender does bust this a little bit. If you were to disaggregate by females, which we did, if you remember, some of this stuff goes away in a weird way. So it's strange would be the answer for you. But young girls tend to do better in a lot of different measures in K-12 schools than boys.
And this is just using state tests, right?
Yes, sorry, I should have told you that. These are the Ford exams.
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of inequity in standardized tests. Do you think that a shift, from the state level and how we assess kids would, I say, so this is from a parent perspective, right? So I have a first grader who, he's so smart, but he scores in the 5th percentile on the standardized tests. But he's, I'm not worried about him, but he doesn't, and even his teacher said, well, maybe he's just not a good test taker. And I also have a middle schooler who also does not do well on standardized tests, but he's been identified as a gifted learner in other capacities. So and they're both black males. So I just wonder, like, if there's a shift at the state level where we assess these kids differently, we'll see that, of course there's going to be an achievement gap still, but I think that they have other, like, intellectual abilities that aren't necessarily captured on these tests.
I think that is really important. We have known for a very long time that standardized questions on many of these large tests are biased. And
Especially culturally biased.
especially culturally biased. And it goes to, like, I know I'm oversimplifying it when I'm giving you the railroad example, right? It's goofy, it's funny, we can all laugh about it. But it is perpetuated in these tests. The cultural experience of the dominant race, the dominant class, tends to be what's reflected in the assessments. And there are moments when these kids look at these tests and go, I have no idea what they're asking me, right? And that plays out in this data in a particular way. But it doesn't mean the data should be ignored. It means the data is one piece of information that should make everyone stop and go, wait a minute, that's not right.
It plays out, but here's what I say, I'll age myself here. I started teaching sociology in 1991, and we used this example of the SATs. Why are we so slow at learning this problem? Why? It makes no sense. I mean, we could write the test differently. It makes no sense. It's horrible when you teach and it's that many decades later and you're still going to use the same examples and the same critique. I've been trying to get students thinking about that, and people thinking about that. I also have a flash son who tests like terribly, but he's super smart, right? So, and you know what? He also is so smart that he says, what is this test doing for me? How's this actually helping me to take this test? That's how super smart he is, that he reads it, he realizes that a lot of what's on there is not relevant to him or meaningful to him, whereas he'd much rather sit down and have a debate or a class assignment where he can dig into it. So why haven't we changed?
People don't like change, is my easy answer to it. It takes time, pressure, and dedication from people like us sitting in this room to actualize that. Otherwise, the status quo always wins. I mean, I've worked in government for too long, let's just say that. I'm getting too old. And I can tell you that the amount of effort that is needed to make a small change in something is monumental. And it's often conducted and led by a small group of people who are willing to sort of, as I would call it, damn the torpedoes. Because they know that choice, that effort to push on the system, to make it do something different, could potentially cost them their career. It could cost them their job, it could cost them their elected office, it could cost them friends, right? Like I told you, I'm in an education family. My parents have been doing this forever and a day. One of my parents' friends is a reading recovery teacher. And when she saw my name associated with Act 20, she called me once a week for a long time to just absolutely pepper me. Like, how could you do this? This is so unacceptable. You're degrading my profession. This is funny, but it's also an example of that change, that effort to push on this is a big shock to the system, whether we count it that way or not. And we have to take stock of the fact that we can't completely destroy the system all at once. We have to push it, break it, let it resolve, push it, break it, let it resolve, but keep the arc of change going in the right direction.
You also had a slide earlier, another really important number that might be layered over this is the difference between the racial diversity, the older diversity, also the leadership compared to the students. And I'd be curious if there's even enough data to look at it and wonder the percentage of Black and brown instructors, leaders in the district have any impact on.
It's less than 5%.
Right, I know, so it's too small of a number to really assess, but.
It's astonishing. It's astonishingly small.
But,
And
yeah.
we used
So
to do.
the change is probably not, we're the state that had what Gloria Lazo Billings comes from, and we're still struggling with this.
I will also tell you, we used to do a pipeline journey of educator of color, and it was in this presentation. And what it shows you and tells you is that the group gets so self-selected small that by the time you get to the end, where it's I'm going to go work in a district, you're dealing with a fraction of a percent of the kids who in high school said, I'm willing to teach. And along that journey, you're losing them for a variety of different reasons. It's not one choice. It is the death by 1,000 cuts that happens to candidates of color as they're progressing to become teachers. And that should be alarming to all of us because the research continues to show us and this is where the part I'm going to get on my soapbox again, having a teacher of color in a classroom benefits everyone, because it pushes people on their journey to understanding that the world is not homogenous. It is not just a bunch of Tom McCarthys with goofy mustaches running around the world, right? It is diverse. People are different. And when we can push each other to understand that, whether it is a disability, whether it is the color of your skin, whether it is the level of your household income, when you see more people who do not look like you are better equipped to go out into the world and deal with it. It's not a stressor, it's not a shock. My gosh, I've never seen anyone like that before. No, this is normal. And I've met people like you before. And I can work with you, because that becomes really critical when we get into the economy for jobs, because it turns out you don't self-select your employer like that, right? If your employer situates you with somebody who doesn't look like you and you have to work with them, if you can't work with them, you're going to get fired. You're not going to be there anymore. We don't get to self-select at a certain point in life. Okay, done with my soapbox on that. It is better for us to have more of them. It is a problem when we don't, and we do not have many of them. School finance time, everyone. The best part about school finance, and I'm a little behind schedule, is it's actually not as complicated as you think it is. Bet you thought here, you maybe talked to Ann. Ann told you about tertiary aid, negative tertiary aid. That's all scary stuff. If you want to sit down and do some budget worksheets, I can show you how that works. But in reality, what you really want to know, the school funding formula, if you boil it down to its simplest format, is actually like 5th grade algebra, 6th grade algebra. And it is as simple as A minus B equals C. Okay, hopefully Ann built this starting point for this community. But A is this thing that we call the revenue limit. So every school district, all 421 of them, have very different versions of this, but it tells them how much they can spend. It was locked into place in the 1993-94 school year. It was very exciting for the policymakers that did it, because we had some out-of-control spending happening in the state. And what policymakers were interested in is, how do we make sure that there's more of this available to everyone? Because what they were hearing from everyone was, my property taxes are too high. So A minus B equals C, these formula factors all relate to each other, right? So if I govern how much you can spend and I give more aid to your district, that means your property taxes go down. Remember that concept, because we're going to get back to it. So this is actually the biggest version of the funding formula. However, I think when most people think about the school funding formula in Wisconsin, they are fixated on B, the equalization aid formula. And I'm here to tell you the equalization aid formula is crazy complicated. It is still generated in an old spreadsheet that was built when the formula was actually constructed. It puts in all these different factors, and it compares them against all other districts. So the concept that I want you to think about today is that B is competitive. There is a finite amount of resources that is established by the state of Wisconsin. The formula distributes them by a bunch of different factors. We'll talk about some of them. But it means that if my district over here qualifies for more of this, they're likely to qualify for more of this. And if I don't qualify for more of this, I don't get any more of this. It is a competitive funding formula. But you can go home and say, you know what? Wisconsin's got a complicated school finance formula, but now I understand it because it's A minus B equals C. Stay with me, I promise it will make sense. There are things outside the funding formula. We call them, most of the time, categorical aids. Categorical aid, category of student, category of need. That's why they're categorical. Many of them relate to issues like transportation, special education, things that districts face that are not equal in the formula, because remember that constitution piece, 4 to 20 is equitable as possible. This piece up here is designed to handle that constitutional guarantee. Categorical aids are designed to make it legal, because not every district is experiencing the same demographics of kids. Remember my cool maps, remember all that demographics? That's being used now, right? That is what holds up these categorical aids, are what hold up our funding formula as being legal. There's a case called Vincent v. Voigt, if you want to go check it out. It's a lovely read. The last time our funding formula was tested, they specifically isolated a number of student populations that we have already talked about and said, as long as you're guaranteeing them an equitable access to education, the funding formula is legal. When that decision happened, and I believe it was 2001, remember all those slides about things changing in funding formulas, blah, 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 blah. Almost all the reimbursement for those categorical aids was higher than it is now. That is why you will hear some advocates talking from time to time about suing the state and whether this funding formula is legal, because we are on the precipice of not having enough resources to make these categorical aids work like they're supposed to. Large part of that is because we created this thing that's called per pupil aid. Per pupil aid, which if you talk to some of DeMond's colleagues, is a very popular concept. If you have a district with increasing enrollment, it means the state is just going to huck cash at you to spend money. It doesn't go into the funding formula. It is now the largest categorical aid in the state of Wisconsin. $742 a kid. You get that money, you spend that money. You lose that money, you do not spend that money. In fact, you have to cut your budget. It's a very volatile piece, but many administrators like it because it gives them that sort of known commodity, whereas this thing is a big giant equation and a formula that gets a little confusing to explain sometimes. And it connects back to your property taxes. The biggest concept, too, that I want you to think about, aside from this is a thing you should ignore for the most part, is that our funding formula is designed to equalize. What it is designed to equalize is your property taxes. It is not designed to equalize the educational opportunities of kids. And when people say the funding formula is broken, what they're referring to is that last sentence I gave you, which is that we are not equalizing the value of education for a kid. This funding formula is not actually broken. This is doing its job. It is functionally working from a statutory perspective, but it's equalizing property taxes. Questions about this before we go a level deeper? Every time I'm going to stop and ask, because this is where it starts getting deep. So, you want to know a little bit about the factors. How does this all work? Revenue limit. It is a 3-year rolling average that factors in how much we let you spend. There are some exemptions that exist, but it was locked into place in 1993-94, and that 3-year rolling average is by and large the only thing that is impacting the change. You got kids, it's going to go up. You're losing kids, it's going to go down. There are some protections that say if you're losing too many, we'll hold you for a while, but eventually we're going to let the bottom drop out. General aid. A little bit more complicated, as I alluded to. It also accounts for 3-year rolling average, the number of kids you have. It also accounts for how much you're spending. That's where things get into these weird tiers, these value tiers of if you're spending in tier 1, you get this much. Spending in the secondary tier, you get this much. Spending in the tertiary tier, you get this much. Spending too much in the tertiary tier, we're going to take some money away from you. That's why the equalized aid formula gets wild and complex. Categorical aid's much simpler, it's easy, it's fun. You got these kids, they qualify for the program, they get this money. Many of them do not have a one-to-one. They are not what we call sum sufficient. They are sum certain. In other words, the state says, we will certainly give you this many millions of dollars, and you distribute it based on how many kids there are. If you have to prorate it, so be it. That is my example in special education, where we know there is a lot of costs, and the state gives us 32 cents, or 32% on that categorical aid. Most categorical aids are not 100% funded. They are prorated. There's not enough money to pay for the need. So, let's talk a little bit about history here. And now I'm getting back on time. This blue line is the history of the per pupil revenue limit adjustment over time. And what you will see is that when we created the modern funding formula, you will hear some old heads like myself talk about it as the three-legged stool. So this compromise where Governor Thompson was working with one house that was Democratic and one house that was Republican, and they were grappling with this thing in 1993-94 called computers. IT and education spending, right? It was running out of control. Some districts that could afford to do it are raising their property taxes, buying all kinds of computers, and driving these anomalies in the funding formula. And a group of legislators got together and said, whoa, 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 this is getting weird. One district is spending a ton of money, the other one's not spending enough money. Remember my competitive funding formula piece? It meant that aid was swinging around wildly. So policymakers were thinking, how do we get our arms around this? And they came up with this compromise. They were going to freeze spending for 1 year. They were going to put in revenue controls for 1 year to allow the state to catch up with costs. And the state would in turn spend 2/3 of the total cost of education out of the B calculation to make sure that everyone got something. And the control factor was that there was inflationary adjustments. Inflationary adjustments on how much districts could spend, but critically important because, as I'm sure you know, 80% of all funding is dedicated toward the people doing the job, also an inflationary adjustment on income and health benefits for teachers. What we commonly refer to as the QEO, or the Qualified Economic Offer. So this is the happy period My dad, the teacher in school districts, thought Tommy Thompson was a crook. He hated this idea, it didn't work. I now get to go back home and joke with him about him living in the greatest period for teachers in the history of the state of Wisconsin. You were guaranteed to get an inflationary adjustment. It was wonderful. I think if he could go over and do it over, he wouldn't complain as much, but it's not the life I lived. But this system hummed along in time until you get to this marker right here in 2008 and 9. You remember my fancy maps? That's when we hit the Great Recession. I had no gray hair on my head. I was, I think, like 20-something years old, and I was clerking the education committee in the Wisconsin Assembly when this happened. And I remember distinctively having this big sit-down meeting in Governor Doyle's office where we were talking about what the heck are we going to do. Inflation at this period in time in this particular school here, right here, was marked at, I believe, like 3%, 2.8%. State revenues were in a downward spiral. We were not collecting enough general purpose revenues to fund that. And in spite of the fact that we had federal stimulus dollars coming out of our ears, we couldn't figure out how to spend about $300 a kid across the state and pay for it so that that C factor didn't increase, so that property taxes didn't go up. So the grand compromise was, we hold you flat, $200 a year for 2 years, and then in this year right here, we're gonna give you $275, regardless of what inflation was. And most economists at that point were predicting inflation to bottom out, to be zero or negative at that point, coming out of the Great Recession. Because they flooded the market with the stimulus cash, right? I gotta tell you, I thought that our labor partners were going to kill us. I thought this is gonna be the point where I lose my job, they're gonna run us out of town on a rail, it's gonna be terrible. I don't think anybody predicted that when the governorship flipped and several of the members of both houses turned conservative, that what instead we would find is what most people commonly refer to Act 10, which was, by most characterizations, a labor law, but what it also was a change in how we fund schools. So, who was around in the state of Wisconsin in the 10, 11, and 11, 12 school years? Who lived here or was part of the state? Anybody? Okay. Good. Most hands are in the air. How many of you owned a house at that period of time? Maybe rented. Okay, we got a pretty good showing of that as well. Did your property taxes go down by 5 or 6% in that year? They did? Where did you live? I'm teasing. On a statewide average, what happened here is that when we reduced the revenue limit by a fairly large portion, we also reduced equalization aid by $894 million. So we took from the funding formula knowing that A minus B equals C to keep C flat. So instead of returning that money to property taxpayers, we repurposed it across other programs that were not solvent. So in the state of Wisconsin, we were experiencing a shortfall of cash. And where did it come from? Most of it came from K-12 education. We started giving things out in tax credits to people once we had more return revenue. And what we did not do is restore a funding formula. Okay? When many states coming out of the Great Recession made massive investments in K-12 education, we kind of farted around the edges a little bit, gave per pupil aid back, but held revenue limits largely flat. We did, however, start to plow money into equalized aid. So if you were thinking about your property taxes in this portion of time, they probably did go down. In most communities, there was a property tax decline, and it was rather steady. But unless you are getting these factors of inflation, of how much you can spend, when we plow money into B, or equalized aid, it does not allow a district like Wauwatosa to spend another dime on kids or education. It reduces the property tax share in education. So as we flatline how much districts can spend, for the most part, and plow money into equalized aid, we are not changing the equation in terms of how much districts can spend. So what happened in this period of time is that these sort of anomalies in how much districts spend when comparing each other to became exacerbated. And the only way out of them was an increased reliance on referenda. And I think eventually, we'll get to the slide, I might even scoot there faster. In the face of some of this stuff, what we saw was many districts going to their communities and saying, hey, our revenue limit's frozen. We might be getting aid from the community, but we can't spend it. And in that same critical period of time, we saw a big jump in the number of referenda questions. So bigger dot, more questions. Blue line is the passage rate. More districts were asking their local communities for operating referenda, non-recurring and recurring during that period of time. And they were wildly successful, which is good news. Good news for communities, but not so good news for those districts that weren't passing. Because remember me, I'm the guy that said the B factor in A minus B equals C is competitive. So if I am in a district that passes a referenda, I am taking resources that are finite away from a district that could not pass them. Which means I'm impacting my neighbor's property taxes whether I like it or not. That's how the system works. Wild times in K-12 education. I am going to stop here because I've thrown a lot at you. I want to make sure that I get some questions answered if you've got them. And then in about 5 to 10 minutes, we're going to break and talk a little bit about what we can do differently. I promised I was going to call on you, and I just got rolling tonight, and I'm sorry about that. What did I skip? What do you want to know that I didn't get to? Funding, demographics, anything's on the table. I got stuff if you want me to just ramble, but questions are good. Go ahead, quick. Yeah.
I don't know how various districts pay for it, but I looked it up. Urban Institute said we're one of only 7 states that doesn't provide anything, whether loans, like tax dollars or anything for buildings. And so I know, one, that capital referenda are different, but also some districts, do end up shifting some of their operating dollars to that as well. Could you speak to how we do or don't support that in Wisconsin?
Yeah, and oddly, we've gone in fits and starts of actually supporting this. So in, I think it was like 1991, there was a crisis in Wisconsin around health of buildings. I would argue we're at that point again, but at that point, we had 2 instances where the state of Wisconsin, the DPI, was looking to condemn school buildings. The buildings were not passing local building inspections. And so the state looked to the building commission and said, we're going to create a revolving loan fund. And we're going to let districts borrow against the building commission fund to do projects. That was, at the time, a first of its type in the state of Wisconsin. Most of the time up to that point, and now too, the building project piece would have to be some sort of local initiative through a referenda or a district seeding, and maybe Dr. Means you remember what the fund number is off the top of his head. There is a fund in school finance that allows you to place aside general revenues to grow basically a pot of money that you would leverage into a building project. But it's a localized decision. The other instances of this happening have been specialized to unique needs. We've had energy efficiency referendas in the past where if you were looking to upgrade your system to be less reliant on energy costs, you could take those out. Those are now banned, I think, until the year 4000 something, happened in the gubernatorial veto. And we also had some school safety initiatives to reduce the cost of those. But you're right, Quentin. We're a unique state in the fact that there is no state loan fund, there is no state incentive. All of the activity around whether or not you want to upgrade facilities is localized. And it's harmed if you believe that new buildings are good, it has harmed the state of Wisconsin's education system. I'm here for you, remember that.
All right, Tom, I have a question.
Go.
About open enrollment.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, some of the things we touched on tonight were how like these arbitrary boundaries limit the resources that students have. How Black students, whether they come from poverty or not, are less likely to perform well on standardized tests. So I'm from Ohio. I was an educator in Ohio. I've only been in Wisconsin for 2 years. Open enrollment was a new, program and way for public schools for enrollment for me. And I just wonder, and I read some article written by someone in the education field that they thought it would be a really great program, right? If we kind of reduce some of those things that you talked about, whether it's arbitrary boundaries, access to resources. I just wonder your thoughts about that. I mean, I don't know.
Sure. Open enrollment so it's important to go back in time and remember what open enrollment is. So open enrollment, created in 1999, 2000, as a means to allow districts to take kids who would normally fit in their regular programming when they had open seats. So the policymakers that designed this often referred to it as a means to fill classrooms, not build buildings. That was the talking point we heard over and over and over again when open enrollment was originally designed. I think that right now, open enrollment in some districts is still used that way. In other districts, it is used as a means to potentially build buildings. To potentially build buildings, to think about how are we increasing and driving that. Because if you remember that enrollment conversation that we've been having, many districts are experiencing a loss of enrollment. So they're trying to figure out, how do I keep this afloat? How do I continue to offer things to kids? And if you remember that the program itself was designed to fill seats, not build buildings, the dollar amount is low, right? So if you're going to take open enrollment, you're going to have to understand you're not getting the revenue limit per kid. You're getting a lesser amount that's designed to reflect the fact that the district they're leaving still has to educate the kids that are still there, and the district that's taking them is doing so with the understanding that it is not getting the full freight of the revenue limit. I think there's a lot of conversations that are happening in the Capitol right now that are focused on, maybe we should treat open enrollment as if it's a one-for-one equation. So in other words, your revenue limit authority goes to the district that is educating the kid. Everybody follows the kid is the common talking point. And I think for some districts that would be great. For other districts that would be completely devastating. They would lose a lot of their base. Because if you remember this A minus B equals C thing we've been talking about, A is the culmination of property taxes and state aid. B is that state aid piece, and C is property taxes. So if I say, hey, Milwaukee, give TOSO 100% of your revenue limit authority, that's property taxes and state aid that are going here, not just state aid. And in fact, a number of districts, their open enrollment payments are still upside down at a student level because they're not getting enough state aid to offset the cost of that open enrollment payment. This is a long way of me saying that open enrollment is such a localized issue. It's so driven by how the funding formula treats you, how you're using it to benefit what the school district is doing. And it's not really a conversation about whether or not that kid's getting served or not.
Yeah.
Just to be really honest with you.
Because Wauwatosa has certainly used it over the last 20 years as a fulfillment strategy to keep our buildings open, right? As many districts face declining enrollment, I think that's where we find ourselves.
And I think also, just knowing too much about your district, it's also part of a global equity initiative too, of saying sort of like, we know that there is a desperate need over here. We know we have space to help these kids, so why don't we try it? I think that's noble. I think the population that worries me, now if I'm just being selfish about this the most, is students experiencing disabilities, because we are seeing a precipitous decline in the number of open enrollment seats related to special education. They are required to note whether it's general or regular education. We do not see the same level of proportionality, so that means that there is a lost opportunity for students with disabilities to access the program. It's not fair.
What about programs like Chapter 220? Just as you talk about like these boundaries, like these arbitrary boundaries that like in state funding and how it's not equitable across different districts.
I'm trying to get in trouble today. I think 220, if you look at the history of the Chapter 220 program, specific to the academic success, the thing that limited 220 was that there was an arbitrary cut on thresholds of how many kids you could take that limited the success of the program, and it made it easier to get rid of. But 220 was of all the integration programs, when you look nationally, 220 was an outlier in terms of its success because it didn't require kids to be bussed out. It didn't require kids to be bussed in. It allowed districts to take them if they were voluntarily willing to, and it gave districts resources. It said, oh my gosh, this is a 220 kid. I don't care if it's a black kid or a white kid. They qualified in the program for one form of integration or another, and it incentivized that behavior. And it worked. It was expensive, but it worked.
Did that number of like 90% of black students being only in seven districts change? Was that different in Chapter 220? I mean, was there more, like, were the black students more dispersed across districts, or were they still concentrated?
It was still a fairly concentrated program because 220 really was Milwaukee, Racine, Madison focused, and it did impact the suburban districts surrounding those school districts. But as I mentioned at the jump, it had a limiting factor. So it said you can only take 220 kids up to a particular threshold of changing the overall demographic of your district. So you had a lot of districts specific. I think TOSA was one of them that capped out. They couldn't take any more 220 kids. They wanted to, but the state said, nope, there's a limiting factor on this. You can't take it anymore. So I think if you could go over and wave your magic wand, I know the program was essentially phased out. I think the correct policy choice in that moment was to move the caps a little bit and allow for more mobility of those kids to access that program in both directions. Because there were white kids from suburbs being bused to Milwaukee or being bused to Racine, and then there were districts that were exchanging kids the other way. But a lot of it's personal experience too. I mean, I've talked to kids. We did a little bit of a qualitative research when it was winding down. There were some kids that felt like they were forced into the program, and they didn't like it. It's an odd deal, but in terms of an integration program, instead of forcing people, it felt a lot better than what many states did.
And unlike open enrollment, I can't.
That's precisely right. Yeah. It was a far more favorable program to the sending and the receiving district. Who's got any more school finance questions? I got some more slides if you want to see them. They're pretty boring though, and I don't know how to make them exciting. So this is some examples of like cost breakdowns. This is the guarantees I was speaking to in the equalization and formula. One of the other things that I do want to touch on very briefly is that there's a factor running in the background of all school finance that is choice. And it has changed over time. And what it looks like now is that school districts are given a non-recurring revenue limit exemption for choice, whether it is an independent charter school, a new 2X charter as we call it, or the Wisconsin, Racine, or statewide programs. Milwaukee is its own thing, so please think of it over there as that. It is nearly fully funded by the state. In the course of 2 years, it will be. The rest of the choice programs all are done by looking at kids who access the program and saying, okay, where do you live? Great. Based on where you live, we're going to do a deduction of your aid, and we're going to give that local district taxing authority to make up for that loss of aid. That decision, I made it sound real smooth and nice and clean. It happens from October 15th to November 1st. I think if you talk to Dr. Means, he's planning his budget well before those counts come in, and those counts can be a touch on the disruptive side. I'm trying to downplay that a little bit for you. But for many districts, they didn't even realize their kids were going to a choice school, right? So they look at the revenue limit worksheet that we populate, and on October 15th, our school finance teams get blown up because they're asking questions like, where did this kid go to school? What is going on? Why do I have a non-recurring deduction? What does that even mean? Because as these things have grown, their statewide impact has also grown. Where are you, slide? Show me, show me, show me. I will get there, I promise. I think I left it in here. I have a moving map that's beautiful. So this is an animation of 9-10 through 22-23. It will kick on at some point, and it's going to show you where choice students reside. So this is their residency, this is where the deduction exists, and what you will notice is that as the programs have grown, as their enrollments have sort of increased, the amount of kids they can take, this deduction is happening in more districts in the state of Wisconsin. We're almost to the point where it's happening in every district, but not quite. There's another factor that is causing this to grow in recent time, is that choice schools can actually provide instruction virtually, just like their public school counterparts. So in other words, if I've got a school up here somewhere where a kid is leaving and going into the choice program, and we turn on the fact that maybe they're going to a school in Milwaukee, they ask us all kinds of questions. How is that possible? Why is this happening? That's how it works. The impact is large. It's great. The dollar figures now in the coming school year are nearing $300 million. $300 million in total cost from Milwaukee and all of the different various programs that are largely being deducted from local property taxes and aid that they would otherwise receive from the state. It is a finance challenge. It is one that I believe is solvable, but it is one that is not being solved. It's kind of a runaway issue, and there are several people who believe that that is unconstitutional. Because it is taking property taxes from one place and giving them to another, which arguably violates what is the uniformity clause in the Wisconsin Constitution. It says, your taxes have to stay in the area that they are being taxed. That is my little bit of choice for you. Here are some payments. Dr. Means, we were talking on the way in. In the most recent biennial budget, the annual amounts for choice have gone up significantly. There are a number of districts in the state of Wisconsin where a high school choice kid exceeds the revenue limit amount for the school district. The average revenue limit in the state of Wisconsin is right about $12,300. Which means there are some people below it, there are some people above it. So, what are we going to do about all of the things that I told you about? I left you a good old 20 minutes to brainstorm in a workshop or to ask more questions. My answer for you in this regard is that this information is solvable. It just requires a group of people that are willing to put pen to paper and think about what our kids in schools need to solve some of the issues that I just laid out for you. Nothing is impossible. Questions, thoughts? Do you want to brainstorm? These are the 2 prompts that we're working on. Now that you've got all this knowledge, what are we going to do with it? How can I help you think? I like that. I heard a big sigh here, which is generally the result that we get. I don't mean to be a wet blanket. I wish that, like I said, if I had the silver bullet for a lot of the things that I've told you, I'd be running around giving it to everyone. But I think it requires people to collectively think about how to change this equation, because as we were talking about with the consolidation question, most of the policy drivers come with benefits and drawbacks. Look at that.
I will say, I think, as a school board member here in Tosa, I think we're doing some of this work, especially to answer your first question on how can a diverse and supportive school community best for all students. We are putting a focus on culturally responsive teaching and, having our teachers building relationships with our students and, really focusing on the students who might not have a sense of belonging in their schools. And I think trying to empower our building leaders to set those expectations for our teachers, right? I say this at board meetings, but we've given our teachers everything they've asked for, whether it's raises or support staff or resources. Now it's time for us to hold them accountable to meet the needs of our kids, and especially as TOSA historically is becoming more and more diverse, racially and socioeconomically.
That's beautiful. Can I bottle you up and take you around the state?
But I also think there needs to be a bigger focus on building relationships. I think that's so key. I'm an educator, I work for MPS, and when I can develop that rapport for my students who don't look like me, it's pretty magical, like for them to see a trusted adult that believes in them, right? And I think at the very root of it all, that's where it lays. Like to have that one educator or trusted adult in your building that believes in you and kind of elevates you from who you are.
That was strategy number 1 in the Achievement Gap Task Force, if my memory serves me right, Dr. Means, is relationships.
Yeah.
And it, the points that you're making, it also transfers into the home. It's about how you get the parent and caregiver involved and understood and bought into what's happening in the classroom so that they don't necessarily feel like they need to go berate. And when a teacher has to make a hard decision about something, it doesn't become a point of inflection and questioning. And I know if you're teaching an MPS, you live that every single day, right? It's how are you convincing somebody that you are part of that caregiver ecosystem and you are thinking about their kid when you're doing these things. And it is not easy. And I would argue we don't compensate you enough for how much work that you have to do in that regard.
But I think that's the work. That's the work as an educator, and I want to continue to uplift and support our staff, but also come to a point where, it's broken systems, right? We have to rethink these systems that don't meet the needs of all of our students, and especially our most marginalized students. And that's hard sometimes. Change is hard. But I think it's necessary, if we want students to maximize their full academic potential.
I think the other thing you mentioned about safety is critical too. It's, 100 different bodies of research, but the simplest factor about it is if a student isn't prepared to learn, they're not going to learn. And some of it is going to be safety, some of it is are they fed? Do they feel engaged? Do they feel heard? And all of that points back to the ability to have a trusted adult and a relationship with that trusted adult. Sorry, 1 and then 2. We got 2.
So the first time I saw that first question, the word supportive is what jumped out to me. And I think a lot of times we think we're supportive, and we're not. We're supportive until there's a problem in our kids' classroom, and then we're on the other side of the table and we're making them complain. And then when I saw this question again, the word all jumped out at me because I don't think there's enough people here who think all is what it actually is, that all is actually for all. And I always talk to parents in particular about intentions versus impact. You may have good intentions by the way you show up and the things you do, but that doesn't mean it has a positive impact. And that's a hard conversation to have. But it's something that we need to do more of. How are we, as the majority, showing up, and what harm are we causing? We cause a lot of the problems that we think about, basically, what I'm saying.
I was always the like warrior advocate in this conversation about like, oh no, it's so easy. And then I had a kid. And I had a kid who's neurodiverse. And it is brutally challenging for me to backseat that because I know that there's a lot of resources around my daughter. And I know that at the end of the day, she's going to be okay. But when you're doing this democratic thing of, it doesn't matter if you're in a public school or a private school, it is still a format of democracy. Because you are sending your kid to a group of people who are not you, and they're making decisions in the moment, and you are not in the room. And how are you sort of giving to this idea of being supportive and collaborative in that environment and not just immediately devolving to, it didn't work for my kid, so it must be broken. And again, like it's so hard. But I think we're all capable of it if we commit to it. Just not easy. Jump in.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, or my question pondering is around that relationship building and how to make that happen in the middle of asking educators to do all the other things, meet all of these other needs and build a relationship and know your students. One of the strategies that I've heard some people talk about it at some of the different conferences, it was something that we talked about here in our community, was doing this kind of soft start to the school year, where you spend the first couple of days just getting to know your students, maybe getting to, doing some, I don't know, early understanding of who they are, what are their strengths and weaknesses. It didn't land well. Our families were not open to it. They did not like that. They wanted to jump in and start learning. It's really important to do that. And our teachers didn't like it either. So,
Yes, I remember that, and I was so mad that that didn't pass. That survey that went out was a very low response, right, compared to the size of the district. And then I was thinking about the evening sessions that the board has held, and where the academic one. That library was full. Look at the one last week. It was empty. So there's certain people who show up for academics, and then it became talking about culture. And
It is a community that's very focused on academic outcomes. But I don't think that they see the correlation of building relationships and doing that groundwork, and that will only elevate, not only their kids, but the other kids as well. And I don't know how to send that message to this community. They
the
don't.
representation who shows up for academics isn't reflective of the
Oh, right.
you know what I mean?
Yes.
So it's certain people showing up for certain things.
Yeah. Community buy-in is hard in this community, right? It is hard.
I'm going to put the mic.
It's that bias of my kid is okay, so why is there?
Right, there's nothing to fix.
Yes, but these other kids that aren't okay, right? So they're the ones that are okay. My kid is okay, so let's just get started teaching them some math, right? That's so.
I feel like I'm turning into like miniature Tony Evers for you right now in front of your face. But like Tony always used to say, I can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, right? I believe that our schools can do those cornerstone academic pieces and also be engaged in a conversation about social and emotional learning competencies. And when we talk to our business partners, and believe it or not, we do talk to them quite a bit, that's actually what they want. They don't like some of the politics that have gone along with social and emotional learning, but when you ask them to stop and describe what you actually want in an employee, they don't care that the kid can do calculus. I can do calculus, isn't that weird? I'm not doing engineering. I can do differential equations, I can still do them. It doesn't give me any value. What brings me value is the fact that I grew up in a setting where those social and emotional competencies were drilled into me because I grew up around educators. And that's what provides me with value. The stuff exists and it's cool. I can come do presentations about math, it's kind of neat. But that's not my value. And I think that realizing and understanding that, you're always going to have the governors who think their kid's going to go on to, you know, find the theory of everything and collapse quantum mechanics and physics, right? And like general relativity. But the reality is it's probably not the case. And those other skills that schools impart and make room for, art, music, social emotional learning, are what really drive the majority of the people that get served. It's hard, but it's real. And that doesn't mean you let off of teaching kids to really do that. It is possible. It's very possible. Yeah.
I'm going to jump on the adult social skills soapbox that you created there. And I think within adults, lots of 18 plus, change is hard. You said that how many times? I also heard you say that when we think about students that are experiencing mental health issues inside of schools, we have to zoom out and look at the family structure as well. So in the same way where we see our students struggling at school for change and social skills and relationship skills, we can zoom out and look at the health of our families as well. And I think in the pandemic, some of us learned new social skills, some of us lost very crucial social skills that now make it very difficult for us sometimes to be here in person and to sit here and to have a conversation and interject our thoughts. And so even as I look at the first question, there's so many words in there that I would pull out as subjective. I would define them different than some people in this room. I would define diverse. Some people read that as racial. Some people read that as ability. Some people read that as gender. Some supportive at the same time. The word academic for me, as a health and PE person, also includes wellness. That is completely academic, but for other folks, they say reading and writing, practicing. Yeah, we get it, right? So the other part of it was the district and thinking about, and even the state level, the authentic, transparent telling of the differentiation of stories. That we at the state level and at the district level cannot run with a single story of, we got talking at work today about the portrait of a graduate. And that is a fallacy in some sense to think about what the ideal student is going to look like, act like, achieve, and experience inside of a particular school. And to the benefit of local control, we get the benefit of being able to design what that does look like for our students. So it's up to us to decide how do we support all of the community members around us, especially when we don't agree, which is one of the hardest things to do. Full circle, adult social skills.
We got a 5-minute warning. Go ahead.
To the conversation we were having at the school culture night discussion, the few young people that were there, and then I asked my kids later how much they thought it was too, and they agreed. They said, we want relationship time. And it got to this discussion, I can share with Dr. Means about advisory, and what's the curriculum for advisory. And they're like, we really want to have conversations, you know, take the test when we have to or whatever. But and so I think, again, it's like, how much are we listening to our youth right now that really should guide us in how they want to learn and how they think, you know, I know we think, well, I know everything for you and I'll guide you in the right way, but if we want them to be engaged in learning, we need to hear a lot more from what they're saying about what's going to be.
I am consistently floored by talking to current students. And ranging all the way down to like second, third grade. I saw some kids in Clintonville, Wisconsin, like north of Green Bay, that were doing coding of little toy robots. And I was like, oh, this is kind of fun, but let me talk to this little girl and see what she's like, what's in her brain about how this is going. And her ability just to explain to me how this is going to benefit her lately, I thought my head was going to explode. Like when I was your age, I was like chasing kids around the playground, like throwing sticks at people.
Yeah.
And you are able to tell me about how you are learning an exercise in coding, and not just like computer-based, but how a coding mindset was teaching her how to approach other problem solving. And I'm like, who is this child? Clintonville, Wisconsin. She was like 7 or 8 years old. So yes, to the point that you're making about youth voice, empowerment of like, what do they need? They're going to be the ones, like I said, I want to retire and I want their brains to be successful and plugged into the world that they're going to inherit, not stuck in the same sort of status quo machine that I have. It's says, this is what you should do. It's a brilliant strategy. Kids are all right.
Ask you a quick question about your thoughts on maps. Changing it, districts changing, with the changing maps now. Do you have hope? Is there any hope that we're going to prioritize public education down the road? Or is Wisconsin just going to keep underfunding public schools until they sort of collapse?
I wish I could tell you I had unbridled hope, but I feel like it's still a conversation of resources. And I know that we have a record level of resources that are sort of sitting in a parked lockbox, but that's a one-time shot at figuring out how to spend them. And it's going to take a lot of collective force in screaming about the fact that public education, so this one right here, ask me this question, and I would tell you that every single person should write a letter to their elected officials. It doesn't matter what party they're in. Education used to be nonpartisan. It got partisan, and it can go back to being nonpartisan. But it's going to take people holding elected officials' feet to the fire to say, I want this for my community. Go do it. And it has to be a cross-cutting effort. It can't be just a bunch of bleeding heart progressives showing up at a public hearing for the Joint Finance Committee and saying we need to fund schools. It has to be continued pressure at coffee shops and the department store. When you see your state representative or your state senator to say, hey, what are you doing to increase special education reimbursement? What are you doing to drive more resources so that I can have more teachers in the schools? I am hopeful, but you catch me on the wrong day and I'll tell you that I'm not.
And I will conclude with that note by saying, while Tom McCarthy and the fine people at DPI are working to save the entire state, the way that our funding formula is constructed in Wisconsin, local community members can save their own school district. So of every 421 school districts, there are residents who can make a decision on what they're going to do for their school district. Tom, we appreciate the work that you're doing to save all of the school districts in Wisconsin, but as we focus on Wauwatosa, there's always an opportunity for the people of Wauwatosa to speak on what it wants for the children in its public schools. And so with that, we appreciate you being here, giving people who are either watching the video or those who are here this evening some source of knowledge. I think what was most gratifying for me is that it doesn't matter if it was the Wisconsin Public Education Network and Chapman or you this evening, there have been recurring themes that our administration has been sharing with the entire community and that will continue to share with the community that I hope will continue to resonate with some people or will land for the first time. But thank you for your time. Can we give Tom McCarthy another round of applause? I'll let our Legislative Advocacy Committee members conclude us and close us out. If you have anything to share.
Thank you all for being here. I know most of you. But no, Tom, thank you for coming. I mean, I heard this a year or so ago, and I think it's really important to kind of educate our community and let them know what's happening, how they can get involved, and how public education is changing. And we have to change the systems around it to make sure that we're supporting all of our students. So thank you. I will post this video online on the Legislative Advocacy webpage. So please, if you didn't get a chance to attend in person, watch it. Tell a friend to watch it. It's really good stuff in there. So thank you all for being here.